Good morning and welcome to Focus on the News. I'm Dick Black and I'll be with you this hour, or this half hour. Let me just start off. There was an interesting article that there's really been a dramatic loss of support for Ukraine in the United Nations. There was a resolution introduced by Ukraine on the 31st anniversary of their country, and this was their independence from the USSR, the old Soviet Union. And I think probably the United States and Western Europe and Ukraine thought that there would be very broad support for the resolution. It's kind of a resolution that generally condemns the Russian attack, and there had been kind of a similar resolution introduced back around March of this year, and it passed at that time back in March, shortly after the war began, with 73% supporting Ukraine. Now it's almost a flip-flop. The support for Ukraine fell from 73% down to 28% in just a 6-month period. So basically, you had 3/4 of all the world's countries supporting Ukraine, and now 3/4 of them support Russia. And I think what's happened is the media hype surrounding the war made it sound like somehow Russia had just irrationally decided on the spur of the moment to go into Ukraine and seize some territory and so forth. And of course, the truth was not nearly that. It was this has been building up since the U.S. and the United Kingdom overthrew or worked to overthrow the Ukrainian government and to install a puppet government in 2014. There actually were discussions held where the U.S. decided which people would have the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Transportation, and so forth in the Ukrainian government. So it was not a very legitimate government, still is not. But in any event, you see this flip-flop as people begin to figure out something about what's going on over there. There was not a single African country, and there are a lot of them, not a single one supported the Ukrainian resolution. Only 2 Latin American countries did. And even in Asia, there were only 4 Asian countries that supported the war resolution, including countries like South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. So when you actually get on, some of the islands that are very, very linked together with the United States in defensive alliances, they supported the Ukrainian position, but most of the mainland countries did not. Almost uniformly did not. So it is interesting. It's sort of becoming sort of NATO against the world at this point. But in any event, we'll see where that all goes. Sometimes the feelings of nations depend on what's happening on the battlefield. And up until now, the Russians, except for the initial month or 2 of the war, the Russians were shifting. They had made an attack towards the capital of Kiev. They backed off and then reoriented their forces around the Donbass, where they had considerable success at a tremendous cost to Ukraine. Well, now Ukraine has launched Their long-awaited counteroffensive, it looked at one point like the whole thing had just turned to nothing. It was just talk, but in fact, they have launched an attack. It remains to be seen how much in depth it will be, but it is certainly incurring a lot of casualties. There are reports that perhaps 1,700 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. Fairly good intelligence, I think, that about 100 heavy armored vehicles, tanks, about half of them tanks and half of them armored personnel carriers, have been destroyed on the Ukrainian side. You would expect much greater losses when a country is attacking, like Ukraine is attacking now. There have been reports of perhaps half a dozen aircraft shot down on the Ukrainian side, several jets, several helicopters. And so there are major losses being incurred by Ukraine during this attack. At the same time, there are Ukrainian reports that they may have killed perhaps 160 Russian soldiers. Battlefield casualty reports are notoriously unreliable. And so they all have to be taken with a little grain of salt. It's a little more reliable when there are reports of armored vehicles that are destroyed, because those are visible from satellites. And so you can come up with reasonable approximations of the armor losses, and then you can sort of correlate those to the reports of actual battlefield casualties, because armored personnel carriers carry troops into battle. Tanks have a certain number of men who staff them, who actually operate them. So we'll see where it happens. I think certainly prayers for the Ukrainian soldiers and prayers for the Russian soldiers who are dying. This whole war, the war has been unnecessary. I view it as Obama's folly, because he was the one who really laid in place the framework for the war in Ukraine by overthrowing the legitimate, duly elected government of Ukraine in 2014, and then pouring weapons in to begin to make preparations for the war with Russia. So here we are today. The soldiers on the two sides are, for the most part, good, decent people who simply are caught up and they're doing what they are told to do. So in any event, prayers for everyone in Ukraine, and we'll see what comes of this counteroffensive. It's so far a very expensive one for Ukraine, but you never know. Things could shift and it could become expensive for Russia also. Okay, here's the next, this is a total shift of topics, but I think it's interesting. The Washington Examiner has a report on someone who was one of these transgender, basically, as we all know, you can't change your gender, but you can change the way you dress, and there are some very grim things that are done to go beyond that, to mutilate your body. And this article is about a man. Now, when I say man or woman, I'm talking about a biological man or biological woman. This is a man who is detransitioning. In other words, he has lived as a woman. He's tried to make himself look like a woman for some years now. And he now says he was brainwashed and he regrets ever having his penis removed. Now, this we've always had cross-dressers, uh, men who pretended to be women, women who pretended to be men. It's a minuscule number, percentage-wise. It's a very, very small part of the population. But I've encountered one in a very direct way over many years, and I've seen them at demonstrations. But anyway, this fellow who transitioned before reversing his decision now claims that he was brainwashed by gender ideology. The man he's 32 years old now, and he was 24 years old when he transitioned. In other words, he let his hair grow long, he started putting on makeup, and then he started doing things that were beyond that, and things that are beyond fixing. And one of them is that he removed had surgical removal of his penis, and in a most grotesque sort of surgical operation that gives him sort of a 1-inch imitation vagina. It's just a truly repulsive type of thing. We know that there are many young girls who get swept up by the propaganda, the things that they're being taught in public schools about all of this transgenderism and how wonderful it is. And those girls have their breasts surgically removed. But this is even worse, where you have a man who has his basic genital arrangement deformed by surgeons. It is difficult to imagine how you can claim to be a truly civilized society when you permit surgeons to do this type of thing. We know that there are occasionally going to be people who get swept up by some bizarre notion that comes along. There are always going to be people who are patsies for the latest trend, and personally, I think there should be a mandatory minimum of at least a 10-year, maybe perhaps a 20-year sentence for any person who is involved in carrying out a surgical operation that removes a person's genitals or removes the breasts of a girl. In any event, just to follow through a little bit more on this particular fellow in the story, he says, this is a quote from the Washington Examiner: "I am embracing the fact that I am a man who got brainwashed by gender ideology and that I was in the wrong body and I needed to alter my body to my authentic self." He said, "My body was perfect as it was. I should never have messed with my original blueprint." He said the surgeries that mutilated him cost his physical and his mental health. This is a fellow now who has 2 master's degrees, and he's a certified public accountant. You got to be pretty smart to be a CPA. So he is intelligent. I shouldn't say he's smart. He's intelligent. He's not smart. He's very foolish, but it just shows that highly intelligent people with a high IQ, can be swept away if they don't have a moral and a sort of a common sense foundation. He said he was 24 years old at the time of the transition. He's been pretending to be a woman for 7 years. He said it took only 12 visits with therapists who issued letters of approval for him to allow himself to be physically mutilated. My words, not his. He says, and I quote, "I miss my penis and I completely effed up." Okay. And then he said, obviously, I still like wear makeup and stuff, but makeup and hair does not make you a woman. It's kind of interesting that he would say that. He's actually dressing as a woman, but he knows he's not a woman. So at least he's learned little. And then this fellow is from the Middle East, and he said, well, there was homophobia in his family, and that made him think he might be better off as a woman. And he said he was attracted to men. And he said he never knew any transgendered people in his home country. It didn't say where he was, somewhere in the Middle East. But in any event, he began pursuing a master's degree at the University of Massachusetts. Okay, so you can come to the United States and learn to be an idiot at the University of Massachusetts. That's where he learned about transgendered people, and then he started considering transitioning himself. And now he says, now this is again a quote from the Washington Examiner, I've been so delusional for all these years, and I just wish my family and friends weren't so supportive of my decision. He goes on and he says, maybe if they'd sat down and talked to me and said things like, maybe you'll grow out of this. In other words, he's now wishing that friends and family had been more honest with him and had not just said, oh, well, this is whatever you say goes. People are afraid in this country, especially in the United States, people are actually somewhat terrified of standing up and actually helping friends and family members who are going through something like this. So maybe there's a good message for every one of us that it really is a terrible sin to just allow people to go through this without speaking up and just not becoming a part of it. Okay, let me pass to something else. This is something that really caught my interest when I ran across it. The California Parole Board, Gavin Newsom's men and women they've just released a man. He was the perpetrator, ringleader of the worst kidnapping in U.S. history. And the California Parole Board has now released this man. What he did, he kidnapped a school bus with 26 children in 1976. He took them out, he packed them all into a van, and he buried them alive. He was asking for a $5 million ransom. Now, at the parole board, there were some of the victims who testified, and under the American system of justice, we have laws on victim witness assistance and procedures, and the law says that you're required to contact victims and give them an opportunity before you release one of these criminals. So there were people, and I just have a couple of them that I'll mention. One of them, Linda Carrero Labandera, and she was 10 years old at the time she was kidnapped. And she recalled how the children struggled to escape. Now, this is from CBS News. It's not verbatim. What I'm telling you is not verbatim. Some are my words, but the essence of it comes from a CBS News story. Linda Carrero Labandera was 10 years old at the time, and she recalled how children struggled to escape as a flashlight and candles flickered out while, quote, The makeshift Dungeness coffin was caving in. You can imagine 10-year-old children, 10, 12, 13-year-old kids, and they see the earth coming in on them. They're packed together in suffocating heat underground. Can you imagine the feeling that these children must have had? There's another testimony from Jennifer Brown Hyde. She was 9 years old at the time, and she recalled the lifetime effects of being buried alive and being driven around in a van for 11 hours with no food, with no water, no bathroom, in over 100-degree heat. They have a quote from, again, in this CBS News article, and it says, Madera County District Attorney Sally Moreno said she fears for the state of society. And it has her quote, if you can kidnap a busload of school children, abandon them, buried alive, and still get out of prison after committing that crime, and then spending your time in prison flouting the law, because this was the individual who did all of this stuff was very, had no regard for the law. And it's interesting that Gavin Newsom has some very deep connections with this hideous crime, because his late father, state judge William Newsom, was on the appellate court that reduced the man's life sentence to give him a chance at parole. And then Governor Newsom's father, you could see what a strange mindset this family has, the Newsom family. Once he retires as a judge, what he does is he campaigned for the release of this man and some of his co-conspirators, noting that no one was seriously injured during the kidnapping, nothing to worry about here. Well, it's interesting. Now, Gavin Newsom he tried to play things a little bit both ways. He wrote a letter to the parole board saying, well, maybe you ought to reconsider this. But at the same time, he's justifying their decision. And he says that, well, I acknowledge, and these are not his words, these are mine, but it's essentially what he said. I acknowledge that Woods is eligible for consideration, both because he was just 24 when he was committed. So he was really young when he committed the crime, and because he's really elderly now. Well, that's quite a trick. So Gavin Newsom thinks that you really can't punish him for something he did when he was a young man, and you really can't punish him because he's an old man today. So you can't punish the old, you can't punish the young. Now I got to tell you, when I was 24 years old, by the time I was 24 years old, I can't tell you the number of things. I had been a Marine company commander. I had been a pilot. I had been a flight instructor training young pilots. 24 years old is not that young. By 24 years old, you are fully mature. Even people who are a little bit slow growing up are fully mature. And this fellow was fully mature. He knew precisely what he was doing. He knew how evil it was. He knew the depths of the evil, the hideousness. He understood what these little children were going through. Now, those are the children we should worry about, the ones that were 9, the ones that were 10, 11 years old, who, by the grace of God, clawed their way out through the dirt, tumbling down on them in the darkness after the flames flickered out and after the flashlight flickered out. Only by the grace of Almighty God, these children were able to dig and claw their way through this sweltering heat, 100 degrees out, the ambient temperature, 100 degrees that day, and they're underground in the hot, humid, sweltering heat with no food, with no water, with no light, and they're struggling. They don't know which way is up and which way is down, but they're struggling because they think they can feel this must be up. And by the grace of the Holy Spirit, they were led to the surface. And can you imagine what those children must have felt when all of a sudden they see a spot of light, and then the sunlight starts shining down through the little shaft that they've dug out, and all of a sudden they can actually get some air that they can breathe, and it's not humid, and it's not quite as sweltering. What a feeling that must have been at that moment. But keep in mind, again, it was the father of Gavin Newsom who gave this man a chance at parole and then campaigned to have him released. And here was Governor Newsom, in addition to saying the guy was too young to punish and now he's too old to punish, he says also, he said that this fellow Woods was the name of the criminal. He said, well, he once studied policing at a community college. Well, isn't that cute? So we have a guy who's a hideous, heinous criminal. And if you have the slightest doubt about his culpability and his understanding of the hideousness of what he was doing, the guy even studied to become a police officer. Okay, he studied to be a police officer. He's fully mature, and then he commits this hideous crime. This case demonstrates just how extreme the pro-criminal Democrat policies have become. They're not just merciful, they are pro-criminal, and they are anti-public. The Democratic Party despises the people that they rule. They despise us. You look at what's going on in the military, where they shut down the military when we got a new Secretary of Defense because they've got to root out people who had any feelings of affection for their ancestors. If their ancestors fought with the South during the Civil War, you've got to root those people out. You've got to condemn them. If people have religious objections to getting COVID shots because of their connection with fetal tissue and the abortion industry, if people have strong beliefs, you have to purge them, because you know that if you purge them, that 99% of them are going to be Republicans. So you purge them from the military. So the Democratic Party, it is basically, it has an elitist contempt and hatred for ordinary, everyday American people, people who drive the trucks that bring the food to the grocery store, who stock the shelves, who serve you your meals at the restaurants, who welcome you to the hotels, who make the beds, who do things like that. There is a hatred towards those people on the part of the Democratic Party. They despise ordinary people, and they have a tremendous emotional affection for people who are willing to go out and hurt good people. The people who gun down police officers, the mobsters who loot and burn stores, who chase innocent people through the streets and beat them to death or beat them almost to death in these BLM, Antifa-inspired riots and things. They have a love for these people, and you can see even the most evil of people. Under the Democrats, we've seen them release Sirhan, who assassinated Bobby Kennedy. You saw them release the fellow who tried to murder President Ronald Reagan. They don't believe that there should be punishment. They understand there's political pressure for punishment for crime. And so to a certain extent, they'll go along with it. But wherever they can, if they have some excuse, they clear out the prisons and release these people back into society, where they can then rape and murder. They can murder police officers. They can commit acts of sodomy on little children. And these are the people that they truly have an affection for. So we've got an election coming up in November. All I can tell you is if you think this country is going in the wrong direction, then the time is getting very close to where you need to take action. So this has been Senator Dick Black. Welcome again to Focus on the News, and I'll be with you again before long.